All right, so I know this is a little bit delayed, but I figured that after last week, you guys would be taking a little bit of a mental health break and probably not getting back into the course until a little bit later in the week. But I wanted to get a lecture to you for Module 9 because there's a lot of content, a lot of information that's going to be important for you to know for your final exam and, probably for CRC exam later on down the road. So today we're talking about service delivery systems, and there are a couple of areas of service delivery that we're going to be focusing in on. The first being the vocational rehabilitation process, and then we're going to be looking at private for-profit agencies and what that might look like, and then kind of the other types of rehabilitation facilities, support services, and then we'll wrap it up with looking at the independent living movement and independent living centers and what those are. So to start out by reviewing the VR process, the voc rehab process. So within our state vocational rehabilitation agencies, the end goal of the process, the process of working with a client, having a client on your caseload, is placement in competitive employment. And in addition to placing somebody or helping them to really find a job themselves, we're hoping that that individual is gaining some personal satisfaction with the job itself, meaning that they like what they're doing, that it's a good fit for them, it's a good match, and that they will ideally be remaining in this place of employment and be able to expand and grow their career in the long term. And really kind of at the heart of it, we're looking at satisfactory performance on the job as well, because regardless of whether or not somebody has a disability, every employer can require that their employees are performing the job as it should be performed, meeting performance standards. Now, there are other ways to do a job. There are a myriad of ways that you can perform any number of jobs with accommodations in place. But when you have a production standard or a productivity requirement, it doesn't matter how you get from point A to point B. There could be accommodations in the middle, but employers can require that all employees meet performance standards. So other kind of sub-objectives of the VR process, the client has to understand the service being provided. And so that comes in those initial interviews that we're conducting, or a lot of times voc rehab agencies that are larger especially will have intake interview specialists that will explain really the service being provided, because there are limits to what can be provided in the VR system. And so in addition to understanding the scope of services that can be provided, the client needs to understand that the expected outcome is placement in competitive employment. And so that is the goal of the VR process, to get somebody a job. The client counselor relationship has to be established, obviously, and you hope that it can be a good working relationship. The rehab counselor is really the collector of all kinds of information from the client's background, their history, their employment history, the medical history, all kinds of information is collected by the rehab counselor and put into a case file. Really, the kind of the meat of the VR process is developing a rehab plan or an individualized plan for employment. And then that rehab plan has to be monitored. It can be updated, modified as needed. And ideally, each case is reaching a point of termination within the VR sector, within our state rehab agencies. There's a lot of reporting that goes on because these systems are funded by tax dollars, by both federal tax dollars and state tax dollars. And so taxpayers, yourselves, myself, we have a right to know where our tax dollars are going and how they're being spent. And so part of that reporting is essentially letting the public know this is where the monies are going and this is how it's being spent. And these are the outcomes. The outcome being that somebody is getting a job and working and contributing back to society, essentially. So the evaluation phase of the VR process is pretty in-depth. The client should understand their potential, what they're able to do, their strengths, their abilities. And we're really looking at what they're interested in doing. In the past, when we were working from a medical model, we may have really been directing a client to do a specific job. And if you look back in history, you'll see that a lot of individuals with disabilities were kind of forced into one area of employment, regardless of what their interests were. They were really being limited. Now, whenever I worked at the Job Accommodation Network, if I would work with, counselors or medical professionals that say, well, I have a patient or a client who has multiple sclerosis, what type of jobs can somebody with multiple sclerosis do? And I would say, what does the individual want to do? What are they interested in doing? So a client needs to be interested in what their job is, or you're ultimately not going to be successful in the process. The client needs to understand how their potential and their interests can equal job opportunities. Sometimes the process requires the VR counselor, the rehab counselor, to bring somebody back to earth a little bit, so that somebody's potential and their abilities and their actually line up with whatever that vocational interest is. And really the client is learning through the evaluation phase about rehab counseling, what it means, what it looks like, and what other supports are out there and available to them that would help them be successful in a job. Lots of things that a rehab counselor has to do. In terms of knowing what jobs are, my goodness, if you think about the range of jobs that are out there, not only do you need to know what types of jobs are available in your community, but you need to know what the functional demands of those jobs are. It's a good thing to have an idea of what types of vocational training programs are available, wherever you're living. And that, because it differs really, what might be available to somebody working in a VR system in an urban area may look completely different than somebody in a rural area. Somebody in the north might be getting a different type of service than somebody in the south. It really just depends because funds are used a little bit differently in different areas. Accommodations are a big one. Rehab counselors and counselors in general should be aware of the types of accommodations that are available, what types of accommodations people with disabilities can ask for, and limits around accommodations as well. So that presentation from the Job Accommodation Network is really, truly important, and I will always go back to them as the key source of information for anything accommodation related. So please keep their information in the back of your mind for assignments in the future and in general when you're working, if you need any kind of assistance around types of accommodations. You need to have a knowledge of restoration services like rehabilitation programs. So if somebody is not quite ready to be looking at a job, what types of services, what types of rehab programs are available for somebody to get them to the point where they're able to be really actively participating with you in the VR process. And there's all kinds of other supports out there, from orientation and mobility training to driver rehabilitation, from assistive technology agencies to like Agri-ability, which is accommodations for farmers. So there's all different types of support services out there. There are services for people with disabilities that want to start a small business. You name it. It's just about establishing those connections and asking the right questions. It's amazing the array of services that can be available to somebody, but a lot of the times it has to do with advocating for your client and getting them to the door of the place where they need to get the services. The evaluation process, so we're on like slide 8 here, it's comprehensive, and it's a way to determine the client's current interests, their future interests, because when we're looking at competitive integrated employment, again, kind of looking back through history and what the VR process looked like, once we kind of started taking a client's interest into consideration, people were getting placed in jobs where there really wasn't any movement. These were kind of like the entry-level baseline jobs where, 15 years later, the client maybe still was, doing the same job without any advancement or room for advancement. So now we're looking at somebody's future interests. We're not looking at just putting somebody or client in an entry-level job and expecting that they remain there. We're hoping that somebody with a disability, one of our clients, are going to build their career, just like you or I or anybody else wants to build a career. Our clients with disabilities are the same. So the evaluation process is typically done in about 4 steps. You're doing an intake interview, a medical examination, or gathering information from medical providers. There may be a need to conduct a psychological evaluation or to refer a client to a medical specialist to get additional information if that's needed. And there may be a need to get a vocational evaluation done too. And you guys are going to learn a lot more about what each of these parts of the evaluation process look like when you get into some of your other classes, like the client services course that you'll be taking sometime in the future. But just to kind of give you an overview for now in the rehab program itself. So the vocational analysis is basically where the counselor and the client are going through the process. You're asking specific types of questions around what a client's interests are. You're kind of going through all the information that you have and putting it all together and forming essentially a hypothesis about what the vocational outcome would be for your client, what will suit them best. And so you're asking a client, what is your goal? What type of career are you interested in? And then you're kind of asking yourself, is this goal appropriate? Is this job goal something that the client will be able to attain? I mean, a good example of this is if you have a client who has, let's say, a developmental disability, they graduated high school, but have no additional training and are not able to get into a college degree program, but they want to be an accountant. So we know, based on what we know about the job of an accountant, that you have to go to a 4-year college to get a degree in accounting, to be an accountant. Oftentimes you have to go and take your CPA exam, which is like the PhD of accounting. And so there's advanced education and advanced knowledge that somebody might have to acquire in order to become an accountant. So if you have somebody that you know has an interest in crunching numbers and doing things accounting related, maybe it would be that the goal of being an accountant is not appropriate, but maybe working in an accounting office as an aide or something along those lines, that might be appropriate. That might be a more appropriate goal. So you can narrow down these outcomes, these potential, job options for a client, and kind of get into what is actually available in the area in which the client lives. I mean, you're taking into consideration transportation. What places are hiring? Can the client get to that place? If not, can we arrange some transportation? So there are a lot of different steps that come through with the vocational analysis. You're not setting somebody up for failure, essentially. Now, looking at vocational alternatives, so again, let's say that somebody does want to be an accountant. You know that that's not really an appropriate goal for this particular client you're working with. So how do you find out what other types of jobs are similar? Well, you look at the different resources that are out there. ONET is one. That's probably a pretty commonly used one. There's also the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, or the DOT, which is relatively outdated in my opinion. There's a new guide for occupational exploration, self-directed search, inventories. These are assessments that can be done so that you're, again, kind of narrowing or honing in on the client's interests and what they actually want to do. There's Worker Traits Data Book, Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH. But regardless of what tool you're using, and it may not be necessary that you're using all of these for one client because it can be very overwhelming. And there are some people that are specifically out there to perform a vocational analysis and do this job for a rehab counselor. That's something, a service that can be potentially outsourced to another rehab counselor or rehab specialist. Depends on your agency. But the client needs to be on the same page. Now, when you're going through kind of this goal-setting interview, you're asking the client, what do you want to do? What is it that you want to do at the end of this process? What type of job do you want to be in? You're always going to be approaching the situation and the conversation from a respectful place, even if you know right off the bat that the goal that the individual has is not appropriate. You're not ever, degrading them, making fun of them, laughing, anything like that. You're being respectful and attentive. You're guiding a client toward a goal that's appropriate. You're not coming out right and saying, well, that's not going to work for you. Let's look at something else right now and forget about that idea. So you're being a counselor, right? You're using some of these micro skills that we've been practicing to develop that rapport and establish that trusting relationship so that the client feels comfortable coming to you and saying, I know that I might not be able to do this, but what else is available? We really are guides in this process. Clients absolutely have to be active participants. We are showing them that we support autonomy, that we support that they are a participant in the overall process from start to finish. They have to agree with the goal. They have to sign off on a rehab plan. So they're making kind of these informed choices with you, whether that's identifying vocational objectives, kind of evaluating each objective thoroughly, picking one to pursue, picking a specific job out there that they might actually want to follow through on. And really, they're taking that next step on their own to be meeting employers, to be going through an interview. In some cases, a rehab counselor may be participating with the client in an interview. Whenever I did job placement for Cigna, I never did. So, there would come a point where I would be guiding the individual, helping them along the process. We would be narrowing down the job options. My clients would be, identifying potential openings and putting in their applications, putting in their resumes, and then it would come time for them to interview. And that was where it was hands off for me. We could have those role plays, which I did have a role play with clients, before they would interview to prepare them. But that was it. They had to go and present themselves to the employer and make that first impression themselves. So, for me, I would not participate in the interview process, although sometimes that does occur. Just depends on the client. So the rehabilitation plan is essentially, it's a plan. So you are outlining what has been done, the evaluation results, the vocational options that you and the client have worked through together. You're kind of making a list essentially of what steps the client and you as the counselor are going to be taking next in order for that goal to be reached. And so you're developing what's called an individualized plan for employment, or IPE, not to be confused with an IEP, an individualized education plan within the school system. Although if you're doing transition services, you're probably going to be looking at both IPEs and IEPs. So, can't be any more confusing, right? The client is the primary developer of the rehab plan, but ultimately it's being approved by somebody, by you and by your supervisor. So there's a list on slide 15 of what the rehabilitation plan might look like. There's specific steps, objectives that are presented, deadlines are set, responsibilities are clarified. Sometimes you're actually including in a rehab plan the cost of services and who will be responsible for the cost of providing the services, whether it's the client or the rehab agency. And then you're, potentially putting in there what the expected outcomes are, and any post-employment follow-up services that might be provided as well. For most state agencies, they're going to have these plans developed. The forms are going to be developed. It's not something that you would be coming up with on your own. And so it's basically just like filling out a form and people signing off on it. So then it's just specific. If you're interested in looking at what a rehabilitation plan looks like, I would say use our friend Google, and you can find a couple different options on there. I'm positive of it that people have put out. So in terms of job placement, it can be there. This is kind of where a lot of the psychoeducation comes into play as in our role as rehabilitation counselors or vocational rehabilitation counselors, because some individuals, people with disabilities, have difficulty explaining the skills that they have, the strengths that they have, the education that they have acquired. And this can depend on the type of disability that the person might have. But, one way to think about it is for individuals that have disabilities, really they've spent, if not their entire lives, a good portion of their lives, their most recent part of their lives, hearing about the things that they can't do, hearing about what their inabilities are, hearing about why they can't perform jobs. For individuals that have a newly acquired disability, a lot of times, like for me, I was working with people on Social Security, and those individuals would have to be out of work for a period of time, and then essentially tell judges, within the court system, I can't work. This is why I can't work, and they have to list, all these reasons why somebody can't work, and then all of a sudden they're coming to us as the rehab counselor, and we're saying, well, yeah, let's look at what else you can do. It may be that you couldn't do the job that you had performed for 25 years, but let's see what else you can do. Some people may have been out of the, not really needing to look for a job for decades, years, especially individuals that are kind of becoming re-employed after a period of time out of the workforce. And so they may not understand how it looks today, how everything is done usually on the computer. You submit CVs and resumes on the computer. You apply for jobs on a computer. You may not hear back from somebody ever. So there can be this learning curve for some individuals that kind of have these poor job seeking skills, essentially. Even dressing appropriately, following up on job leads, knowing how to conduct yourself during an interview, knowing what to say and what not to say. I worked with a lot of people that felt like they needed to disclose their disability on a resume. And while that's somebody's personal choice, that was not anything I ever supported. And I would, try to explain to them why it can be detrimental to put that type of information on a resume, and how they could think about the other side of it. So there's a lot that comes into job seeking. It's not easy for anybody to find a job, but our job market right now is pretty good. The economy's not too bad right now. And so, whenever the economy is good, that means that unemployment for people with disabilities tends to be lower, which is a good thing as well. But still, we can be looking at conducting things like a job readiness clinic for our clients. And this might be something that you are able to participate in your internship as well. So, for the next couple of slides, I've got some examples of things that we might do in the VR system to make sure that somebody is prepared to go and look for a job. So whether it be conducting a job readiness clinic, suggesting that our clients participate in a job club. So these are kind of like those group settings, or getting a buddy system in place so that your client is being taught techniques to increase their job seeking capabilities. A client might need a job trainer, so somebody specific that's working with them one-on-one. There can be direct placement intervention. So that could be either placing somebody on the job and doing a job analysis in that job, or conducting a job analysis or outside of that facility. There are facilities that do that, so that you can understand really what a client is able to physically do, and that again can help you narrow down job options. Supported employment is the new terminology that we're using. We're not really looking at sheltered workshops anymore. What happened in more recent years was that we kind of realized that sheltered workshops didn't lead to employment in competitive jobs. Individuals were being placed in sheltered workshops and just kind of staying there for the remainder of their lives or careers. And so there was a major shift in how we viewed sheltered workshops, and then looking at supported employment as an alternative. Now, there are still shelter workshops out there. Some individuals with more severe disabilities benefit from shelter workshops, and it does offer a lot of support for them. But supported employment is kind of the new thing that we're looking at as an alternative. There are two kind of approaches to supported employment. Either you're training somebody outside of a workplace, you're placing them in an actual employment setting, training them again, and then following up. Or you're placing somebody in a work setting, training them there on the job, and then following up later. This is really more of an individualized approach to providing job placement, and sometimes an individual will need more intensive follow-along services or a job coach to assist during the process. So in terms of job development for you, it's really useful to be getting out into the communities that you're living in. Rehab counselors are often out there beating the pavement. They're walking around, they're meeting employers, they're meeting managers of stores, they're connecting on that individualized level. A rehab counselor is expanding their network of connections, because when you get to know somebody that's an employer, on a more personal level, then it's easier when you're getting ready to place a client to say, oh, well, I know this person that works at this retail store or this grocery store or a law firm, and I think that they'd be willing to help get my client placed successfully. So you're promoting the client, you're promoting the service that Voc Rehab provides, because a lot of employers don't know about VR agencies, and employers really can benefit from expanding their their repertoire of people that or areas that they look for potential employees. Sometimes employers, will kind of do the go-to, hiring, like hiring.com, indeed.com, but employers really can benefit from letting Voc Rehab Services know when they have job openings as well. And you can develop kind of cooperative agreements, and there might be some incentives that can be provided as well. Okay, so moving right along and looking at the private for-profit sector. So the private sector is essentially, we're looking at a fee for service. So this is not something where the government is providing funds, essentially. So the private sector has really been around for quite some time. If you're looking back into the 1970s, there's been a private sector. Really, the advent of the private sector came about when we had laws like the Rehabilitation Act that came into play, and the ADA especially. There was a need for forensic rehab counselors to be working with agencies like Social Security. Workers' comp really brought about a need to have trained counselors on staff that knew how to help get employees back to work. And really, businesses did see and continue to see the advantages of having rehab counselors on staff to get those employees back to work sooner that are able to get back to work. Lots of different types of available jobs in the private sector, whether it's within disability management, workers' comp, disability insurance. There are vocational experts out there. There can be medical case management that needs to be done. Working for a corporate agency, manufacturing environments, hospital settings, you name it. A lot of organizations are seeing the benefit of having a rehab counselor on their loss prevention or safety teams, because rehab counselors are trained to see kind of, what areas or what types of jobs might lead to like a repetitive strain injury or an injury in general, or what types of accommodations can be put into place that benefit both employees with disabilities and employees that don't have disabilities. Private practice, of course, is one area. Consultants, being a consultant is a big one. Typically these are people that have a lot of experience, but nevertheless, that's from both the VR side and the ADA as well. So a demand for jobs within the private sector is really due to two major forces. One, the need for employers to reduce disability-related expenditures. It costs a lot of money for employees to be out of work. If we're looking at the costs associated with providing leave, and sometimes paid leave, and then you're looking at the costs associated with medical expenses, if insurance is part of it, if you're looking at the cost that's related to productivity of having somebody out of a job. And oftentimes employees need to be out of work for an extended period of time to seek treatment, to become stable. Depends on whatever the condition is. Maybe they're having an exacerbation of a disability or a medical condition, and that's fine. But a lot of times people can get back to work in some capacity with accommodations, potentially on a part-time basis even, and that helps decrease the expense that's really going out the door with having employees out on leave. And I think with the advent of the ADAA and disability management companies bringing these conversations up a little bit more to employers, especially larger employers. Employers are really now seeing the benefit of getting people back to work sooner than later. So there's knowledge that's needed in order for rehab counselors to be able to do this. So we have to be aware of all these aspects of job development and placement. We have to understand the community programs that are out there that promote return to work. RTW, return to work. We have to be aware of union laws that might come into play, different labor laws that might come into play, state legislation that might be different than the ADA, because it is, depending on the state that you might live in. And of course, we have to have a very well-rounded understanding of what the ADA actually means, the purpose for the ADA, what employees can ask for, and what employers can expect. So there's two sides to the ADA. One is from the employer perspective and the other from the employee perspective. So, looking kind of quickly here at workers' compensation, the goal of workers' comp is to return an injured worker to gainful employment as quickly as possible, whenever medically feasible. There's kind of a hierarchy of return to work within the workers' comp world, and workers' compensation laws are specific to the state, and so anybody working within a workers' comp system is going to really be looking at their state workers' comp laws. But really the hierarchy is that somebody is coming back to their own job first, ideally. Some employees may need light duty. Kind of the next level is somebody can't do their job, and they can't do their job even kind of in this light duty status. They're looking at getting back with the same employer but a different job. And lastly, looking at a different employer and a different job kind of as the last resort, because that area might require that the employee get additional training, on-the-job training, enter into a new training program. So that's kind of the hope that we don't have to do that one. Short-term and long-term disability. So employers purchase policies, both short-term disability and long-term disability, or an employer might offer short-term disability and an employee has to purchase long-term disability. STD and LTD policies are separate from workers' comp. They're separate from anything related to the ADA. They're separate from Social Security benefits. So when somebody says, I'm hoping to receive disability or I'm on disability right now, it is always important to clarify what that means, because there are some state disability benefit programs too. So somebody potentially could be receiving long-term disability, Social Security disability, state disability, one of all of those, all three of those. One might be offset by another. It just depends. So policies under short-term and long-term disability are developed by the employer and the insurance company. You can hear my dog barking in the background, but policies have a specific way of defining disabled. So a lot of times it does look like what we see in the ADA and what somebody with a disability would be considered, but it can depend. There's a definition of successful return to work. So in long-term disability, you're receiving a portion of your regular payments, and then after like a 2-year period of being on long-term disability, that insurance agency will be looking at whether or not you can go back to any type of employment. So long-term disability doesn't last forever, and a lot of times Social Security comes into play because LTD agencies will work to get their beneficiaries on SSDI so that it will offset the insurance payments. So it can be kind of confusing. And with that, I'm going to pause it for just a second so you guys don't have to listen to more than a half an hour at a time. So take a break and then we'll come back and pick it up on slide 30.